Hey there, folks. We are back with critical thinking, and our first topic for the third section of class, so preparing you for exam 3, is language. Because a good critical thinker recognizes how powerful language is. So make sure you have our first language lecture open for yourself, entitled Language Number 1. Language 1, which says words, and it's got a bunch of cute little bang splat vrooms from like superheroes. So make sure you have that lecture as we're continuing this discussion. So let's begin. So moving on to slide 2, what I actually want you to do is, before we talk about language, I just want you to watch the video which is on my YouTube channel, which is really all about words. And again, it's closed captioned if you need it. And what I want you to do is I actually want you to watch it twice. First, just watch it. And then after you've watched it, I want you to watch it again, right? And so first just watch it and then come back. So press pause and go watch it and then come back. Done that? Okay, good. All right, so now that you've watched it once, what I want you to do is watch it again. Because what this short video really gets at is how language is complex, right? In this video, they're essentially showing you graphically all the different shades of meaning that can be behind a particular word. And what I want you to do is I just want you to reflect on how the creators of this short video did this, where they used light in 2 different ways. They used break in 2 different ways. And you know, in English we call these homonyms, right? Words that sound the same but have subtly different meanings. But recognize that what happens when we have the same sounding word with 2 subtly different meanings? Well, what that suggests to me is that there's an underlying similarity to the concepts, like that you break a heart versus you break a plate versus you there's a break in pool. It's about a sundering. It's about a ripping apart in all of those different usages of that one word. Or the fact that something is light. You can be talking about light as a feather, or you can be talking about the light in a room. Either way, there's a sense of non-heaviness. There's a sense of airiness. There's a sense of being lifted up in all of those usages of the word light. Right? So keep that in mind. So just sort of think about the beauty and complexity of language. Because so moving on to slide 3, what we're going to be talking about today is really how powerful language is to shape perception. That language is really a human superpower, right? If we think about other species may in fact have modes of communication, right? Maybe even dolphins have a complex language, right? But none of those languages have the deep complexity or nuance that human language does, right? Human language is symbolic. It's abstract. That means we can talk about things that we can't touch, right? We can talk about love. We can talk about democracy. We can talk about companionship. And with these sounds that I make, or if you're a deaf person, in the visual words that you create, either way, I'm able to communicate from one person to another about big ideas, about things that maybe you can't even touch, things like love or power or contentment, these basic ideas, right? And so that's what I want to cover, because a good critical thinker recognizes that the awesome superpower that is human language should be used with responsibility. To quote Stan Lee writing for Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, right? That's the idea. So moving on to slide 4. There's a quote that actually says, "Man is a symbol-using animal." And that's what language is. Language is just a symbol. It's the idea that we attach meaning to these sounds, and then we can use these symbolic sounds to represent big ideas, to allow one person to literally put his or her own ideas into the mind of another person. What an amazing ability that we can do that. But recognize then that language isn't something concrete. You can't touch it. You can't touch the word love. You can't touch the word apple. You can touch an apple, but the word apple you can't. And so because language is abstract, because it's not concrete, you can't touch it, there can be a lot of debate and there can be a lot of misunderstandings and disagreements when people use language to talk with one another and communicate with one another. And so we're going to explore this topic today. But first, I want to convince you that language is in fact a superpower, that human beings have an incredible capacity to process this very abstract idea that we call language. So on slide 5, I have a link to a TED Talk that I want you to watch. It's a little bit older of a TED Talk, but I think it's still relevant. It's about basically CAPTCHA and reCAPTCHA technology, and then also about the power of human beings to process language. And even though this video is a little old, I believe it's from 2008 or 2010, so it's a little older, it's still very relevant today. Everything that this man has to say about language and our human capacity to process language is very accurate. Is very, very accurate. So, so watch it and then come back and we'll talk about what the video showed. All right, we back? Great. So in this video, he really talks about the idea that human beings are so good at processing the metaphorical context of language, the subtle nuances of language, that we really have an ability to process language that computers may never be able to parallel. Computer translation is actually much better than it was in 2010 when this talk was first given. I believe it was 2010. Right? The computers are much better at it now. A lot of progress has been made in the last 6 years. But computers still fail. They fail to understand the context. They fail to understand metaphor. They fail to understand what's called idiom. And so they can't accurately communicate the deep level of nuance or translate the deep level of nuanced ideas that are contained in human language. And that is what I want you to recognize, how incredibly powerful language is as this tool for human beings. Right? And so moving on to slide 6, I want you to think about all the metaphors that we have in language, the sort of the deep analogies, these things called idioms, and how the metaphorical and abstract nature, the symbolic nature of language sort of pushes around our perceptions. Language, as we talked about when we talked about eyewitness testimony, subtle changes in phrasing, subtle changes in words can actually alter people's memories and alter people's perceptions. And they basically shove around our emotions. The use of language is emotional in nature, right? Choosing one word instead of another can alter how people think and alter how people feel and alter how people process information. And so let's think about some metaphors. I have some here. For example, war. War has this sort of concrete definition, but think about all the different ways that we use this concrete word that sort of brings about certain shades of meaning and makes us think in a certain way about ideas. When we talk about a war on drugs or the war on poverty, it brings to mind the idea of violence. It brings to mind the idea of a winning side or a losing side, right? If you have a war on drugs or a war on poverty, there's got to be a winning side and a losing side. And who are those winners and losers when you use a metaphor like that, right? Or we talk about the battle of the sexes. Same idea, right? There's a winner, there's a loser. And so keep that in mind. And this is just one example of the kinds of ways that language can alter and shape our thinking. And so moving on to slide 7, let's talk about Shakespeare and explore a little more about what I mean when I say that language shapes our thinking. So Shakespeare says, "A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." That's actually from Romeo and Juliet. It's Juliet talking about Romeo, that she wishes that he would have another name because if he had a different name, not Romeo Montague, then he would still be just as wonderful and her family wouldn't be in conflict with him. And I'm just going to go ahead and disagree with Shakespeare because I just straight up disagree with this quote, because I think that the names that we give various ideas can actually shape how we feel about them. For example, if I decided to start calling roses puss blossoms as my own personal pet name for them, and I said, "Here, smell my puss blossom," you'd be all, so sure that I'm going to smell that. And even if I started calling it that, right, pus blossom, it might in fact alter how you interact with it, right? It might alter, in fact, how you perceive and remember that experience. Language shapes our thinking. It shapes our perceptions. And a rose by some other name might in fact not smell as sweet. Because this gets at, moving on to slide 8, some vocab words we have to learn. And it's the first one is the idea of a denotation. That words have dictionary definitions. They have sterile, neutral dictionary definitions where the word is describing something more concrete in a literal fashion. So the denotation of a word is simply what that word means in the real world in a concrete way. It's what that word points to or refers to or indicates. Like if you looked up in the dictionary an apple, it would say, a fruit, a red fruit that is edible, and it'd have some other denotive meaning. So denotation is just the literal dictionary definition of a word, right? DD, that's kind of easy to remember. A denotation is the dictionary definition of a word. And it's not the denotations of words are some part of their power. Our ability to use utterances or sound utterances or symbols on a page to communicate one concrete idea to another person. But it's richer than that, because moving on to slide 9, words also have what are called connotations. And this is actually where the altering of perception, the changing of perception, the altering of memory, and sort of the emotional evocative quality that language has, where we can use language to manipulate people or use language to influence people, persuade people, use language to effectively alter how people think about the world. That's mostly in the connotations of a word, the emotional meanings, all the other ideas that a word is connected to. And so let's sort of explore this idea of connotation versus denotation. Right, so let's move on to slide 10 and think about like the word Christmas, right? Christmas has a denotation. It's a sometimes religious, but often secular holiday in the Western world where people give gifts, do have decorations, right? That's the sterile denotation of Christmas, held on December 25th, right? All of that is just the basic denotation of that word. But think about all the connotations of Christmas. When I say Christmas, what do you think about? I think about cookies. I think about Christmas trees. I think about other religious holidays. When you say the word Christmas, I think about Hanukkah, which gets me thinking about lights, which gets me thinking about also gift giving and greasy foods, right? All of these things are the connotations of this sort of Christmas word. Or if I say Halloween, that also has a denotation. It's October 31st, a secular holiday with religious roots where children dress up and adults dress up and you go out and children ask for candy door to door. But there's so many other connotations to that word. Excitement, festivities, parties, the joy of dressing up, and candy, the joy of candy, right? All of those things are the connotations of those words. And a lot of the manipulative or persuasive, to use a less judgmental term, of language comes from the connotations of words, all those other ideas that those words are connected to. And so let's think about, and I would also argue, moving on to slide 11, that with the power of language comes responsibility, and it's a good critical thinker recognizes the connotations of the words that he or she is going to use in any persuasive attempt. Because a good critical thinker, theoretically, is going to try to persuade other people to their point of view. If you think of yourself as a good thinker, you've probably given a great deal of good critical thought to various topics, and you often might want to persuade people over to your point of view, right? And a good ethical critical thinker recognizes that the words that he or she chooses to use in any persuasive attempt are going to affect the people that they're communicating with. And to recognize that language can be used for good, it can be used to persuade people effectively, but it can also be used manipulatively, right? And that's probably not the best, most ethical use of language. A good critical thinker can also recognize when language is being used manipulatively against them, right? We have to recognize that advertisers, politicians, but even people close to us will often use language that causes some emotional reaction, which then can persuade us one way or the other. And if a good critical thinker is one who reflects before making decisions, then we have to recognize that sometimes language has caused us to have an emotional reaction where we need to stop and reflect. Reflect on why we're feeling the way we're feeling, so that we can make a good decision without being unduly and inappropriately manipulated by the language that was used in a particular exchange. And so in slide 11, I have some examples, again, of exploring this idea of connotation. And the first is, the mouse is next to the apple. Well, what do you picture when I say the mouse is next to the apple? Well, if it was 200 years ago, what would you have pictured? Well, you would have thought of a furry little quadruped with a long tail sitting next to a fruit. But now what do you think about? Do you think about mice and apples, right? And fruits? Maybe. But you might also think of computers and about a mouse that's sitting next to an Apple or Macintosh computer, right? And the idea that Macintosh chose the apple as their symbol, right, has certain connotations and gets you to think about that company in a particular way, right? Apple, good ideas, Newton, apple falls on his head. This idea of good ideas coming from this company is because they chose to use that symbol, right? Or how about a phrase like redskin? Now, there's a denotation of this word, right? A denotation. And racial slurs often have denotations. But different people have very different connotations with this one word. So if you're from Washington, you may have positive connotations about this word, right? You may have gone to many football games, because I believe it's the Washington that has this football team. And so you may have positive connotations with this word, have emotions and memories, remembering growing up and going to football games, and so you feel very positively about this phrase. And it becomes difficult for you to understand then why somebody else has very strong negative connotations with this word, right? It's a racial slur. And there are whole groups of people that when you say this word, they think about genocide, they think about racism, they think about forced adoptions, they think about a history of tragedy when you use a racial slur like this. And I think that both connotations are real, meaning they exist within people. And you have to ask yourself, if you want to be a good critical thinker, if you want to be a person who pursues truth with a capital T, what kind of words do you want to use, right? We live in the United States where there is freedom of speech, which means we're allowed to use any words we like. But what words should you choose? I know me myself, I would choose not to use racial slurs in everyday life. I would choose to be more careful, because do I want to use words that are going to make other people have strong, negative, horrible reactions? I prefer not to, right? Because I recognize that the connotations of certain words are powerful, right? And so for the purposes of this class, I'm not going to tell you which words to use. You're free to choose any words you like. I'm only going to suggest that recognize that words have meaning beyond their literal dictionary definition, and to use the power of those words with caution, or at least with care and respect. And if you choose to use a word, knowing that that's going to cause another person to have a strong negative emotional reaction because of the very real connotations of those words, recognize that you're doing that, and at least own it. Take ownership of that choice. And the last one I want to talk about is over the hill, right? Over the hill is a phrase. And I'm going to use this as another example of how one phrase can have very different connotations for different people. Because think about it, right? Over the hill. How do you feel? What ideas is that phrase connected to? Well, probably it's going to be very different depending on which side of the hill you are on. If you are climbing up the hill because you're young versus walking down the hill because you're older, that phrase is going to have different connotations. And so moving on to slide 12, recognize that two different words, right, can have the exact same denotation but different connotations. And to recognize that, I think it's important to use words with care, or at least acknowledge that different words are going to have different reactions in folks. So, and this idea is called the semantic differential. The idea that two different words can have the exact same denotive dictionary meaning, but very different connotations. So, for example, lady and woman are both, what do they point to? They point to a person who either was born a woman or was born or identifies as a woman or is presents as a woman, right? Woman and lady literally point to the same idea, the same kind of person, but they have very different connotations. To my mind, lady is more passive, it's more weak, it suggests a good person or a good woman, whereas the word woman is generally more neutral or even strong or active or more agentic. And so they both point, like I could use lady and woman to point to the exact same literal physical being in the world. Whether or not I call that being in the world a lady or I call her a woman is going to have different connotations and thus different reactions in the person that I'm referring to, given the situation, right? The power of connotation. And I think, moving on to slide 13, I think that there are lots of times in everyday life and in politics and in advertising and in the human experience where we choose words on purpose because we know that they're going to have different connotations. And we do this in order to persuade, in order to get other people to feel a certain way about our point of view. And so let's sort of talk about another hot button issue. Let's talk about abortion, right? There is a neutral, denotative thing we can say about this broad topic of abortion. Abortion is wrong versus abortion is right. That's sort of the denotive dictionary definition, competing beliefs. But that's not the kind of language that gets used by either camp, right? Because there are people that are very polarized on this issue. People who believe that abortion is wrong under any circumstances, and it's an immoral choice, versus people who think that abortion is permissible under any circumstances, and that's all right. So you end up with these two sort of very competing camps. There are lots of people that fall in the middle of these two extreme viewpoints, but let's just talk about the two very extreme points of view. So you have abortion is wrong versus abortion is permissible, or abortion is a right. But that's not how these two groups describe themselves. And it's certainly not how they describe each other. And the subtle changes of word choice, where the denotive meaning is the same, but the connotations are different, is intentional. It's to get people to think and feel a certain way about that point of view. Right? So the belief that abortion is wrong, you might call that person anti-choice. But, right, the other side, oh, you're anti-choice. Versus they might refer to themselves as pro-life, right? Right? You have very different connotations to the denotive meaning of this exact same stance. But it works on the other side too, with this purposeful, persuasive use of language change. Right? We have, abortion is legally permissible, or that belief, anti-life. It's a culture of anti-life versus pro-choice, the people who have this point of view, right? Anti-choice versus pro-life. Anti-life versus pro-choice, right? And it's manipulative. It's intended to be manipulative. And it's about using different connotations of words to have some sort of persuasive effect. And is this wrong? I don't know that it's wrong, but recognize that that it's not neutral. That these words are being used on purpose to, and when words are used on purpose to alter perception, or to alter memory, or to persuade, that can sometimes interfere with good critical thinking. Because, and moving on to slide 14, I want to make it really clear that I'm not being metaphorical here when I say that language alters perception. I mean that in a very literal way. Language activates, different words activate different parts of our memories, and they alter in a very real way how we perceive the world. Memory is not a videotape into the past, and perception, we know, is not a videotape into reality. We can only pay attention to a few things at a time. Remember change blindness? But it's more than that. Depending on the situation that we're in, we may actually encode different experiences differently depending on the language that gets used in a particular situation. And so here is a classic height study. Essentially, this was a true experiment where they had the exact same speaker give a talk to 5 different audiences. All these audiences were students, right? They were college students. And so the exact same person gave a talk to 5 different groups of students. And it was a true experiment. So what they manipulated is simply the label that they gave to this person. In one group to one audience, they described this speaker as a student. To a second audience, they described this speaker as a demonstrator. To a third audience, they described this speaker as a lecturer. To a fourth, as a senior lecturer. And lastly, to the 5th audience, they described this speaker as a full professor. And then, so that was the independent variable. What was the label that was given? And there were 5 different groups on that particular variable. So then what they did, as a dependent variable, they asked them, how tall did you think the speaker was? Not how good, not how knowledgeable, but simply how tall were they? A physical, objective idea, right? Not subjective, but literally, how tall do you think they are? We're staring right at them, give it maybe an estimate. And what they found, moving on to slide 15, is the only audience that was relatively accurate about how tall the speaker was the audience that was told this person was a lecturer. If they were told they were a senior lecturer or a professor, they actually saw the person as taller. Their perception was altered. They saw this person as taller simply because you slapped a label on their head of professor. That's how powerful language is. Call someone a professor, suddenly they look taller. And it was the exact opposite if they called the person a demonstrator or a student. They actually saw the students and demonstrators as shorter than they actually were. Again, when I say that language shapes thinking, I mean that quite literally. And in fact, moving on to slide 16, very often, the connotations of language become more important than their denotive meaning. And what I mean by that, no pun intended, is that oftentimes words get all this baggage. They get emotions and other ideas attached to them, and then the connotations become more important than the denotations. It's almost as if the dictionary meaning of that word becomes either irrelevant or less important than those connotations. And I think racial slurs are a really good example of this, right? You can argue that racial slurs have just a denotive meaning. And hey, if I don't mean anything bad by the racial slur, I'm just using it to be funny or whatever the justification is. That racial slur simply has a dictionary definition, and I'm not using it in a racist way, so it's totally okay. But the problem with that idea is that the connotations of racial slurs have undergone something called reification. The connotations have become reified, which the root of that is to become royal. And you can't separate the connotations from the denotations anymore. The connotations are bigger. The connotations are more important, arguably, than any dictionary definition could ever be. But there are lots of things that get reified. Things like brand names and designer labels are a great example of words that get reified. So let's explore this idea for a minute. Right, so we've got like different kinds of purses. I like shoes and I like purses, right? And you've got two different purses. Now, arguably, you spend more money on a Coach purse or than you would on like a Target brand purse, right? Because you think to yourself, well, the Coach purse has finer materials, it's going to last me longer, and to some extent, that's probably true, right? But what about the difference between a Coach purse and a Prada handbag? Right? We have a Coach purse about $300. You have a Prada handbag, $3,000. $3,000. Is there really going to be that much better materials, that much better craftsmanship, that much better, I don't know what, in a $3,000 handbag versus a $300 handbag? I'm going to argue no. The reason why you're willing to spend $3,000 on that handbag has nothing to do with the denotive meaning. That Prada handbag, it points to that purse. The literal dictionary definition of what that word Prada handbag means has become way less important than the label itself. In fact, designer labels are so connotation-wise, so much bigger than their denotations, people are willing to spend money on crappy handbags that are knockoffs just so they can have the label on there. I'm willing to carry around a substandard handbag just because it has a label on there, right? Or when people buy ugly items, just because it has a designer label, right? They're willing to sacrifice the quality of the denotative object simply to have access to the connotations. That idea is reification. And there are other things that have been reified too, right? Grades, A, B, C, D, and F, right? It's got a literal dictionary definition, refers to how many points you've earned in the class. Oh, but the connotations of an A versus an F, so much more important than the dictionary definition, the denotation. So grades are reified. Or low self-esteem, to say somebody has low self-esteem, right? It has some dictionary definition, but that label, or mental illness in general, low self-esteem or schizophrenia or depression. You walk around with some connotative label around on your shirt where the connotations are ever so much bigger and more important than the denotations. That concept is called reification. And to recognize, moving on to slide 17, that the meanings of words can often be different from person to person, right? This is called somebody's frame of reference. And I think a good critical thinker makes sure that whenever you're having a conversation or a healthy argument with someone, sort of a debate, a good critical thinker makes sure that everyone is using the same words in the same way. So there's not misunderstandings of language, right? And that the connotations shift from person to person, and connotations shift from culture to culture, and connotations shift from situation to situation, right? Cold, the word cold or hot or probable, generous, cheap, inexpensive, sex. All these words can often have different connotations to different people, but also have different connotations from situation to situation, right? If it's a really cold day out, like it's already really cold, the connotations in my mind of further coldness are probably pretty negative right now. Like, do you want more icy coldness when you're already icy cold? Ooh, no, negative connotations right now. But what if it's really hot out? Would you like an ice cold 7-Up? Ooh, now there's positive connotations because of the shifting and changing of how that word is used in a different situation. And so, again, we get at the awesome superpower that is language, where the same word can change meaning from person to person, from situation to situation, from time point to time point. And someone who prides themselves on thinking well recognizes and pays attention to the shifting and changing of meaning from situation to situation and from person to person. And so I think that's also important when we think about culture, right? That different words can have, that language is embedded in a culture. And often a culture has very different relationships with language, and it can often reveal a lot of things about those cultures when you think about their languages. And this sort of brings me back to my point from earlier, this idea that language is a superpower, right? And having a word for something allows us to actually think about that idea. And without a word for something, we actually can't think about it. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, let me give you an example of a couple of cultures, and give you an example of how having a word for something allows you to be able to think about it. So in the Hawaiian culture, in their language, there are 108 different words for sweet potato, and there are 65 words for fishing nets, and there are 47 different words for banana. And you may have heard at some point in your life that Inuit people, or Eskimo people, the proper term is Inuit. Inuit peoples have like 100 different words for snow. In Albania, there are 27 different words for mustache, right? Mustache. So what does this mean? Is that because language is redundant? Well, no. It's because, let's say in the Hawaiian culture, there may in fact be 65 different ways of thinking about a fishing net. Or in the Inuit culture, there may be 100 different ways to think about snow. And if you have 100 different ways to think about snow, you can think about snow more easily, more quickly, and in a more deep, meaningful way because you have so many different rich ways of describing this concept. And so the more words you have, the bigger your vocabulary is, the more things you can think about. Don't believe me? All right, let's move on to slide 19. And let's talk about the color blue. The color blue. Now, there's this great Radio Lab podcast from National Public Radio called Colors. If you want to go listen to it, I would encourage you to do that. That basically also recounts this tale I'm about to share with you. There is a culture in the world that doesn't have a word for blue. They don't have a word for it. Simply no word for the color blue. And as a result, they have difficulty in even thinking about blue or even noticing blue in the world. What do I mean by that? Well, here's what they do. They go to this particular culture and they hold up, let's say, 10 different green cards, right? The color green. And so they've got green card here and green card here and green card here. And then in the middle of all 10 of these green cards, they put one blue card. Right? And blue and green are fairly similar in nature, in color. They're close together in the color spectrum. And they ask these and you and I would take a look at these 10 cards and with the one blue card there. And if somebody asked us which one is different, you would say that one in the middle, the blue card, or that one at the end, the blue card. And it would take us a fraction of a second. It would take no time at all. We would instantaneously recognize this blue card. But here's what happens in a culture that doesn't have a word for blue. Because maybe they don't have a whole lot of experience with the color blue, right? Because if you think about nature, it's not like there are tons and tons of blue animals, and it's not like there's tons and tons of blue plants, and it's not like there's tons and tons of blue things, right? Even the sky is the lightest shade of blue that you can think of. In fact, go ahead and look out a window right now if it's daytime. Is that like a super strong blue? No, in fact, as I look out my window right now, I actually see a white sky. It looks hardly blue at all. And so if you think about nature, there's not very many things that are blue, right? And so it's not a big surprise that some relatively not very technologically advanced cultures may not have a whole lot of experience with the color blue. And so they may never develop a word for it. And so there is this culture. It's a culture that is not very technologically advanced. And when you show them these 10 cards with all green except with one of them that is blue, and you ask them which one is different, they don't know. They look at the cards and they go, which one is different? It's like without a category for blue, without a word for blue, this card that has a subtly different shade, blue versus green, doesn't jump out at them, right? Now they eventually get it, but it takes several minutes of them looking at the cards and looking at the cards, and eventually they say, that one is different. That is a different color. But it takes them a really long time. But then if they're given a word for blue and they're shown green things and blue things and green things and blue things, where they develop a word for blue, suddenly they can instantaneously recognize the differences in color. Because, again, language shapes our thinking. And without a word for something, we literally can't think about it. And so if you're bilingual, I want you to reflect on this experience that I'm quite certain that you've had. And have you ever said, oh no, I'm sorry, I can't translate this idea. There isn't a word for this idea in English, or there isn't a word for this in Farsi, or there isn't a word for this in Spanish, depending on the nature of your bilingualness, where you literally can't translate the concept because you just can't talk about it. So I'm actually going to argue that not only is language a superpower, but if you're bilingual, you're like a superhero of language. You can actually think more thoughts than somebody who doesn't speak a second language, right? And so if you speak Hawaiian, back on slide 18, you literally can have 108 different more complex thoughts about sweet potato than I can have. You can think more deeply about sweet potatoes because you've got other words for them. Or if you're an Inuit person and you have 100 different words for snow, you can think more deeply and more complexly about snow. And I'm betting if you look at 4 different types of snow, they would be able to instantaneously recognize the 4 different types of snow because they have the word for those 4 different types. Where I'd be sitting there going, 4 different types of snow. You say they're different? Okay. It would take me several minutes to detect the subtle differences between these different types of snow. That's the idea. When you have words for something, you can think about them in a really powerful way. And I think a good critical thinker recognizes how incredibly powerful language is at shaping thought, right? Without a word for blue, you literally can't see blue. I do not mean this in any metaphorical way. Without a word for blue, you can't think about blue. And again, this tale of mine comes from Radiolab, a podcast called Colors, if you're interested. There's a longer discussion about it, but the research is clear. I looked it up myself. Without a word for blue, it becomes difficult to even see blue in the world. So moving on to slide 20. I want you, this is going to be our third forum post. I want you to watch this TED Talk, which just sort of drives this point home about how important language is and how it shapes our culture, how the very nature and the structure of language alters how we think about the world. And so I want you to watch this TED Talk, and then where he makes this argument that the nature of how we talk about time in different languages alters our ability to save money, right? What? How our language talks about time changes how our culture saves money? Yep. He's an economist named Keith Chen from Yale, and he did this pretty compelling research that showed that the nature of someone's language alters how they save money, right? And then part of your forum post is reflecting on your own language. And if you're bilingual, this is going to be easier for you. Reflect on your own language and think about how language might affect your thinking, right? So go watch that language culture talk and then come back here. So pause me and go watch it and then come back here. All right, you're back? Okay, so first in the forum post, I just want you to summarize the talk, right? Summarize his point of view about savings behaviors and how different languages talk about time. And then your more important task, though, is to think about your own native language and whether or not there are features of your own native language that alter your behavior subtly without you being aware of it. Let me give you an example of that from English. So English has a lot of personal pronouns, right? We use I, me, us, we. And there are some languages where you can just drop away the personal pronoun. You don't have to use it. You can just conjugate the verb, alter the verb, and you don't have to say the personal pronoun at all. I'm going to argue that it's possible that maybe one of the reasons that Western society, English-speaking society, is so individualistic is because of our emphasis in language on the needfulness of personal pronouns, right? Like, for example, in English, when we say, I can say, I broke the lamp. I did it. I broke the lamp. And in Spanish, generally speaking, they don't do that. They say the lamp broke itself. Where English, so Spanish has less of an emphasis on personal pronouns in their language use. Where in English, it's I, me, my, mine. And you must use the personal pronouns in order to speak correctly. And maybe in English, this reliance on personal pronouns is one of the reasons why English-speaking societies are so individualistic, because we are. English-speaking societies are very individualistic. They focus on the individual compared to other more sort of what are called interdependent societies. And so that's the kind of thing I want you to do. I want you to reflect on your own native language and think to yourself, is there something I noticed that my native language is doing over and over and over again? Kind of like Keith Chen noticed this, the way we talk about time. Is there some aspect of your native language that you see over and over and over again that is altering how you think about the world and how you relate with the world? That's the goal for that forum post. And so last thing is just to sort of get you thinking about this idea, watch this very short YouTube clip, which is from a fantastic movie, 10 Things I Hate About You, about how in English, our words for like and love, we use them for a huge variety of things, right? We talk about liking and loving, to talk about handbags and purses and lima beans, and like we use the word love in so many different ways. Whereas in Greek, they actually have 6 different words for different types of love. And what does that mean? Right? So this is just to get you thinking about English. If English is your only native language, if you don't speak any other languages, that forum post may feel kind of hard for you. But I just want to give you an example of ways to reflect on English to sort of help you think about this forum post that I want you to do. What are some things you see in English that may alter how you think about the world? All right, so I'll see you next time, critical thinkers.